So as soon as you get us set up, I'll introduce Jonathan and he can start the conversation with Governor Brown. Welcome, Governor Brown. Thank you. Okay, well, everyone met Jonathan Granoff this morning. Jonathan is president of the Global Security Institute and senior advisor and U.S. representative of the Permanent Secretariat of the World Summit of Nobel Peace Laureates and chair of the ABA Task Force on Nuclear Nonproliferation and advisor to the Committee on National Security of the International Section of the ABA. And Jonathan is going to have a dialogue now with Governor Brown, first introducing Governor Brown. So thank you, and Jonathan, take it away.
Well, this is a real honor because I need a little full disclosure. I'm a bona fide fan of Governor Gerry Brown, 3 times governor of California, and not only a terrific administrator who helped turn the economy around and make California, I think, the 6th largest economy in the world, but he's been a visionary and he's been a thought leader. And I didn't realize he even had a deep background in law. He actually clerked for the Supreme Court of California. So Governor Brown, Gerry, I want to start out and ask you, how did you come to be seized of the issue of the threat of nuclear weapons? I know that now that you're no longer governor, you're chairman of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, you're on the board of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and you're a passionate advocate along with the rest of us. So how did that come about? Muted. Governor Brown, we don't hear you.
Now we're on. Okay.
There we go.
I just have to correct one little factoid. You said that I did something to make the California economy better. Well, I certainly didn't hurt it, but governors don't really affect the economy, and even presidents in the short term don't affect the economy, even though everybody thinks they do, and they get mad at politicians when the economy goes sour. But it's one of those widely shared misbeliefs that is rampant. I had to correct that. Now, how I got interested, well, it goes back to law. I was at Yale Law School during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it scared the hell out of me. I thought, this guy Kennedy, we're going to blow the damn world up. Where the hell can I go? And I was thinking of going to some remote place in Vermont, but then, I had to go to class, so I never got around to it. But that was quite frightening to live through those days, from Senator Smathers releasing pictures about the missile emplacements in Cuba and then going forward. Then fast forward to my time in California, the Nuclear Freeze Initiative was put on the ballot when I was governor. It passed barely, I might say, by about 1 point. And as governor, I was to write a letter to President Reagan and President Gorbachev to freeze nuclear weapons. But as we all know, the freeze was stigmatized very effectively by the powerful people to say that would create a great disadvantage for America as distinguished from Russia. And here we are with the same kind of dangerous mythologies corrupting our understanding of the true danger of nuclear weaponry.
It was the Cuban Missile Crisis that got me involved also. I was interning for a congressman from New Jersey in the late 1960s, and then Senator Kennedy, Robert Kennedy from New York, took a bunch of us interns out for lunch one day and told us literally how close we came to ending civilization. And I will never forget his closing remarks were that two things. One is, if we get every other issue right and don't get this right, it won't matter. And 2, that he considered it the moral and practical litmus test of our time. But since then, we have another threat that's hit us on the horizon that you've been a thought leader and a practical leader in as well, the climate. You convened a summit in California before you left office to address slow burn. Do you see a relationship between slow burn and fast burn?
What about slow burn? Is that how you describe global warming? I've never
Yeah,
heard that phrase.
that's slow burn. Slow
Slow
burn
burn,
is
okay.
climate
Well,
change.
okay.
Fast burn is new.
There's so many new terms that as I live my long life, I marvel at how the language is constantly transmogrified with all new shiny phrases and terms. But I get your point. Yeah, climate is different, but it has devastating impacts, and it has irreversible impacts. And I don't want to get off into climate because we want to talk about nuclear, but it is something that is of great concern. California led the Western Hemisphere in taking real action, and that's big. And hopefully, maybe to wrap this aspect up, we're in a world where nationalism continues to run amok. Nationalism is burning very brightly in the heart of Joe Biden and the Congress and the New York Times and all these other people. So I think we got to deal with the fact that there are threats, nuclear, climate, pandemic, that are of common threat, of common interest, and of common vulnerability. And that's why my vision is one that I call planetary realism. The realism of Hans Morgenthau and Reinhold Niebuhr and Henry Kissinger, but the planetary aspect that we're all in it together. And it isn't just balance of power, but it is understanding that we're mutually vulnerable, and therefore we have a profound reason to collaborate together, despite our differences on human rights, on separation of powers, and all the other issues that separate China, Russia, America, North Korea, Iran, and all the rest. So that consciousness that I call planetary realism is still marginal. It is still deviant to the dominant culture in Washington, D.C., and I would assume in Moscow and Beijing. So you folks at the American Bar Association, the New York Bar, you have your work cut out for you, because as far as I'm concerned, we are still in the dark ages.
You know, you're addressing the paradigm of nationalism and militarism as the pursuit of security as a flawed paradigm of security. This idea goes back to, I read an article of yours, a brilliant article called Nuclear Addiction, a Response from 1984, and you ended it. And it's so prophetic, Gerry. The shared threat to our common existence may yet provide a new foundation, and old paradigms may be transcended in a world that can destroy itself. Morality at a minimum requires truth. I would say realism too. The truth is, in this case, that Russia and the US are embedded in a neurotic relationship that progressively grows less stable. Soon we shall either use our new weapons and die, or rejecting the outworn logic of war, find change in some form of mutual trust. And I would say that vision, which is a moral, spiritual vision, and in fact embodied in the law, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and implicit in the Charter of the UN, is also a practical necessity now. That if we don't cooperate and see our shared realism of protecting the phytoplankton so we can breathe, and the climate so we can live, and pandemics, and persist in these excessive expenditures for nuclear weapons, we won't cooperate and we won't survive. So you wrote in this essay way back in the 1980s that nukes are a kind of addiction. What do you mean by that? I mean, that's a different framework than it's usually addressed.
Sure, that's based on the anthropologist Gregory Bateson, who really developed the thought, the addictive character. And he said addiction, the nuclear arms race is like an addiction, in that as the heroin addict takes the first jolt, shoots it into his arm, he gets a certain sense of well-being. He analogized that to building our weapon systems. He built a nice MX missile or whatever the case may be, and then Russia does the same thing. But after we take that injection, we need another one. and then another one because we're addicted. And the key to addiction is that you become tolerant to the dosage, and you have to increase the dosage. So the dosage increases. The analogy to nuclear arms race is the lethality has to increase. The lethality by the precision of the weapons, by the magnitude of the impacts, by the numbers that we have, the ways and the places from which they're deployed. All of this increases the horror when it finally occurs, and it increases the likelihood through a very important part in this race, this addictive competition. That is deterrence. The fundamental doctrine of the modern nuclear world is that we will stop you from hitting us by threatening to destroy you. And it's all based on creating fear and threatening. Now, the trouble with that threat is when you create that threat, the reaction is not confidence or trust, but it's fear. So the other side, Russia, builds more weapons. And then when it builds a new weapon system or a variation on their old system, then America says, oh my God, we have to do something different. And then we do something more, but we do something a little different than the Russians. And so the Russians say, oh, they've got something a little different. We better copy that, but it'll be a little different. And therefore we have to respond. So it's a constant escalation in nuclear innovation, in differentiation, and a constant increase in lethality, all held together by human minds, not one, but hundreds across the nuclear regimes of Russia and the US, and held together with software that can fail. And in fact, has failed in the past when we've gotten false alerts. So this is what former Secretary of Defense calls the danger of nuclear blunder. Not that deterrence fails, but rather we get an accident. We get a false alert, and the president, having only 20 minutes to decide, decides wrongly and fires one of these weapons, ICBMs that are on hair trigger alert. It's false. And then Russia fires back, and we're off to the races. And maybe human civilization is gone. Now, that idea is not accepted. It is marginal to the Washington establishment, Democrats, Republicans. All the big people feel very comfortable in the world we now live. I do not feel comfortable. Bill Perry doesn't feel comfortable. I don't imagine some of the people listening here, at least I hope they don't. We're in an extremely dangerous position that all we have is this big threat that progressively becomes less stable.
And the very facts of how many near misses, near devastations we've had, how many mistakes, even the Cuban Missile Crisis was based on the false premise that the weapons were not operational.
Right. And the key point here is not that we've had mistakes. We all know that. That's been published. We know the names of the people, the Russians and the Americans who saved us. Bill Perry, by the way, was told in the middle of the night when he was Secretary of Defense that the Russian had launched a missile attack, and he didn't wake the president up because he just intuited and thought based on his experience that it wasn't right. It turned out to be correct. So did Petrov over in Russia, did the same thing. They fired him. So look, the accidents, the dangers are there. The big problem is, why doesn't the president say something about it? Where is the leader who's going to tell us? Did Ash Carter ever say anything about this? Does Pompeo ever talk about it? Does the New York Times want to write about it? Or the Washington Post? No, this is like a secret. The danger through accident is minimized and marginalized. I've talked to key generals. They're not worried. Some are, but a lot of them aren't. So that's our biggest problem, is getting general consensus that we got a problem. And remember the astronauts, they called it, Houston, we got a problem. Well, I'd say to Washington,
Planet.
we got a problem. Wake up. And I think that is our challenge. How do we, as non-members of the priesthood in Washington there or in Moscow, how do we get people saying, oh my God, we have more we got to take care of this. We got to do something about it. Reduce the damn threat now. It's not, and yet the main problem now is what more sanctions can we lay on Russia? What new misdeed can we identify and vilify on the part of Putin? Stipulate. Putin's got a list of 100 faults. By the way, the US has a nice list of its own. So that's not the point. The point is, like in World War II, we got a threat, certainly as great as the threat of the Nazis. And what do? We didn't go point out the human rights violations of Joseph Stalin. We said, let's join together and beat the Nazis. We did. Well, we have to join together to beat this threat of a nuclear blunder by accident, by miscalculation, by who knows what, software failure. So that's the way I see it. The number one question is getting through to people that we can handle and reduce this nuclear danger without compromising all these other things, which they now call core values. I remember when they used to just talk about values. Now they put core in front of it, and that almost becomes like, well, we better go to war over that. This reminds me of 17th century Germany, when the Lutherans and the Catholics killed 1/3 of their country over the difference between transubstantiation and consubstantiation, and of course the authority of the Pope. So we are in a highly pseudo-religious fervor, and we've got to knock it off and get back to some realism. And I would say planetary realism, recognizing the common interest, the common vulnerability that the Russians and the Americans and the Chinese and the whole planet shares together. And that is, don't say nationalism is going to go away. You go away. No, but we have to go transnationalism, planetary realism, or we're going to extinguish humanity. It's just that simple.
I'm involved in a project called Human Security, which is exactly the same as your planetary realism. It's an initiative of the World Academy of Arts and Sciences and the United Nations to try and mainstream human security as the paradigm to address exactly what you're talking about.
Jonathan, I got an objection here. Security. They all talk about security. You know, what's wrong with a good old world peace? That's too soft. It's too wimpy. But security implies military, it implies weaponry, it implies war. And then they always put the word national in front of it. So we're always talking about national security. I think we have to talk about realism and truth and shared interests that transcend security. Remember Eisenhower, he said, if you want security, you can get one in a jail cell. Listen to Eisenhower. He said some very important things with his final address to the nation and elsewhere. So I do have to at least hang a red lantern on the word security. I would want to say, how do we get some trust? Not naive trust, but just trust that the other side is not stupid, that they can calculate these risks, realize the consequences, and adopt measures that will reduce to close to zero as we can the nuclear risk that we're now exacerbating. Everybody's talking about the number one problem is what new sanctions can we put on the Russians? That's not the number one problem. The number one problem is how can we and Russia together recognize the mutual suicide pact that we've implicitly committed ourselves to.
I really like your emphasis on realism and juxtapose it with two major myths that are leading us over a cliff. One myth is the myth of the Roman maxim, prepare for war, receive peace. Peace through absolute strength, which has proven to be absurd. It didn't do anything in Vietnam or Afghanistan, and it just leads to arms racing. And it's not realistic. Where the other is...
Oh, wait, I think, I don't want to say we want to be strong through weakness. We can be strong, but what is strong? The Chinese have 300, 400 million, 300 or 400 nuclear missiles. They feel pretty strong. They're not as scared of us, and we got 7,000 nuclear warheads. So how much do you need? The question is not strength versus weakness, but a clear definition in what does strength consist. That's what we're missing, because it's the arms industry, the propaganda, the nationalist ideology, the fear, all combined to have this Congress totally head over heels in trying to buy more and more weaponry. In fact, the Armed Services Committee, run by the Democrats, had a 14-hour hearing 2 months ago on the $740 billion budget. There's no coverage to speak of anywhere in major press, and there was not much dissent, and they voted out the budget, including a new nuclear weapon system, including the modernization program that's going forward. So there still is a lack of insight, understanding, honest confrontation with the facts, the technology, the world we now find ourselves in.
They are completely ignoring the science, which has discovered that if less than 1% of the arsenal were to go off, it would throw approximately 5 million tons of soot into the stratosphere and render the agricultural base of the planet dysfunctional.
All right, so that's a very good, I want to underscore that point. So we get into a little nuclear exchange. We do 50 bombs, the Russians 50, or Pakistan or India. And now you got the nuclear winter, which, you know, Carl Sagan talked about 20 years ago. Now there's been more research, more validation. We don't have to be 100% sure. At 10% sure would be good enough for me to do everything to avoid it. So the whole deterrence is, if you hit us, we're going to hit you back. Our defense system, our $300 billion defense program that we've developed, that can't stop missiles. You can barely hit one if they know where the missile is going to be in practice. So here we are. Our only threat is, if you hit us, we'll hit you. Therefore, you won't do anything. But what if they send missiles? Are we going to then send missiles back and then ensure this nuclear winter effect? So the whole concept of nuclear deterrence needs to be really looked into, because it has some fundamental flaws at its very essence. Now, I'm not saying we're going to get rid of deterrence tomorrow, but we ought to understand, are we really saying, Russia, if you do this, we're going to hit you back with nuclear warheads? And if we do, does that lead to nuclear winter? If they do, does that lead to mass starvation? Is that our program? Or should we take some other risk, far less, to work something out with the Russians, just like we did with Stalin, what we've done with other people? We certainly, I won't get into all the other unholy alliances that we've been part of, but certainly we ought to be able to form an unholy alliance to make the world less prone to a nuclear accident.
It's also a legal requirement that both Russia and the United States have, pursuant to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, where a set of steps to lead us to that more secure world has been promised in the review processes of the treaties.
Yeah, Jonathan, the trouble is, if you read Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty carefully, it talks about negotiating in good faith on steps that lead to disarmament. So it's got some weasel words that allow a lot of backsliding, or a lot of shilly-shallying. Although I would say the current non-movement toward nuclear disarmament is so gross that even the weak words of Article 6 are in fact being violated. I'd agree with you, but it's a pretty weak reed on which to bottom our nuclear disarmament talk.
Well, it's in the review processes pursuant to the agreement for the indefinite extension. They agreed to entry into force of the test ban, a fissile material cutoff treaty, lowering the salience, strengthening safeguards. All of these steps, kind of the things that you put in your article recently in Politico, these are the framework that they've agreed to, and they're reneging on it. And when the big players renege on treaties, how can we possibly have gain the confidence of the rest of the world?
The big question, you have a lot of smart people looking in here. So I raised the question, how come? Does Joe Biden or his advisors or the New York Times, do they not get this? Why is there a virtual silence with respect to this issue? And I spent a lot of time looking at the media. I've been around my first political office I took over July 1, 1969. Okay, that was a long time ago. So I've been reading the press ever since, and I don't see much on nuclear danger whatsoever. And when I talk to people, and I talk to a lot of the biggies, you know, I can get through to these people. I've run into them at the various now Zoom conferences. There seems to be such confidence in the status quo. There seems to be a childlike belief that all this complexity can be managed to avoid one of these catastrophic risks. So I don't see it that way. I have a darker view, maybe my Catholic seminary training on original sin. And we used to have this doctrine that a lot of people are going to eternal damnation. Well, if you think that's even a plausible possibility, certainly nuclear annihilation is not that far afield. So I'm worried, but I don't see the group of powerful people very worried. They're more worried about getting tough, getting more sanctions, more this, more that. And I think, so that to me says we have a lot of consciousness raising, and we have a lot of educational work, and we need to have a lot of blunt conversation, because we're not teeing up even the first step or idea in moving us toward a safer world.
Absolutely, and there's a total lack of recognition of the hazard of the tension between India and Pakistan, where if there is a computer error like the one you described, they don't have 5 minutes or 10 minutes; they have 300 seconds, and there's a danger of somebody creating the perception of a launch, a computer hacker, not to mention madness or other miscalculations. So we now know scientifically we're all downwind. And yet this obsession with power of the national state has taken, I think, mythic proportions. It's almost like a religious doctrine that has to be addressed. But you know, during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union behind the scenes cooperated with science addressing polio and smallpox. And actually we've eliminated them, but they never told the public of that cooperation. So it's very odd that our political class commerces in fear rather than in success stories. How do you think we can change this? How do you think we can break the spell? It's almost like it's a spell to bring some realism to the discussion, to bring some sense of proportionality to our military budget, to bring some sense of the possibility of recognizing our shared interest to the international political class. What do you think we need to do next?
I have no idea.
Well, I'm very much
That's
in
why
the
I'm on
same.
this program. I figured all you smart lawyers, all you New York lawyers have some answers that I haven't filtered out to California. I mean, the obvious, but it just from the talk in the campaign, there wasn't much talk about this.
None.
It's important to we'll call one of these leaders thugs, and they may well be thugs. They can call us thugs. All right,
So
fine.
what?
But remember, back in the bad old days of détente, Henry Kissinger and Dick Nixon went, and Richard Nixon brought his wife Pat, and they stayed overnight at the Kremlin. Can you imagine the American president taking his wife and spending the evening over there in Kremlin talking about what do we do? And is Putin worse than Brezhnev?
No.
I don't know. That takes scholars. It's more complicated than I can take time to figure out. But we are in a very bizarre, unprecedented period. I think to be more serious about your question, I think we have to shock people, wake them up with the bizarre quality of our current focuses. I'm not saying what we're focused on doesn't have importance, but it is marginalizing these more fundamental issues, profound threats to the world's well-being, but they don't fit into the nationalist paradigm, the nationalist meme that we've got to thump our chests here and say we're tough. We're back into that kind of thing. This C. Wright Mills, I think, coined the phrase appropriate for our time: crackpot realism. That's it. It's crackpot, and we got to get off of that and go from crackpot to planetary realism, not utopianism, not liberal interventionism, not the ideal that we're all going to be Boy Scouts. because we're not. If you look at the kind of narrative going on in America about systematic structural racism, now that itself needs to be put in proper context. But if you take that, at the very least, it means we are deeply flawed, and we have so many things that we have to get right, and we've got wrong in the past, that we should be really focusing on ourselves. Cure thyself, physician. Cure thyself. Don't look at the little dot in the other guy's eye and not see the beam in our own. We have to have much greater self-awareness, and if more intelligent, prominent people to start talking about that, maybe we can make some progress. But I can tell you, it's not easy. The big people are not interested in nuclear issues. It's basically shut up. Let's talk about, now they'll talk about climate change. 5 years ago, that was verboten to talk about. But we've got to get this issue in the mainstream. It's got to be in the congressional hearings, in the mainstream media. That's what I think is missing. So any of you New York people who know anybody at the Times, keep pushing. I've gone to the editorial board, pounded on the table, talking about the doomsday clock. We're 100 seconds from annihilation, but I can't. It's very hard to get a response. You must be in the club, and the club is not really thinking about nuclear accident right now. And that's where you want to make any progress, knock on the door of the club and wake them up. Get the foreign relations organizations, get them talking about this. Get the transition team talking. That's what I think we got to do. And I think we can do that. Joe Biden's a decent guy. He's been around forever. He got into politics in '73, 4 years after I did, I might say. And he knows a lot. So I think we got he's got bright people. I think people on the outside have to make inroads with the people on the inside. And if we wake up, and I think there's a way without compromising our beliefs or even our myths that we can make the world a lot safer than it currently is.
I can tell you, Gerry, that the Global Security Institute, where I'm the president, the World Summit of the Nobel Peace Laureates, where I represent that group at the UN, and the Task Force on Nuclear Nonproliferation of the International Law Section of the ABA, we want to work very closely with you to make this reality of a wake-up call heard, because I think that the myths that we're living under are actually the myth of Thanatos. It's a myth. It's a death myth,
yeah.
And it's absolutely horrendous that we could be pledging trillions of dollars on a venture that the more we perfect the weapons, the less security we obtain. It's exactly the wrong direction. So it's a venture that's as morally corrupt as slavery was. You can't fix slavery by having better housing for slaves. The venture of putting the entire future of the planet at risk is fundamentally morally flawed. But now, as we look at the pandemic and we look at climate and we look at the oceans, we're compelled to find a new paradigm. And I think this idea of planetary realism has to include, and let me just let you get the final word here, has to include the tool of the rule of law. That's one of the, that's sort of the guardrails that we can't forget as one of the elements to bring us to the application of that realism. Because if we continue shredding treaties, generally working on an ad hoc basis, there's no possibility of having the stability and trust needed to get to where we need to get to. So the rule of law has got to be an element to this.
It does. And the rule of law is based on underlying shared beliefs, on a consensus. That's why law pertains in a jurisdiction. And the jurisdiction has common values, common beliefs, common sense about things. I do want to say one more thing, though, of what we're up against that is implicated in the common law in the Western legal tradition. And that is this concept of the individual. It's me against you. It's us against them. It's we against the environment. And that perspective which is deeply embedded into the paradigm of Occidental thinking. That has to be transcended, because we're in a world of interaction. It's not just that I am an autonomous being. I am in response to everything I encounter in my past and in my present. And so is everyone else, and so is every nature, and so are all species. There's a web of life. There's a mysterious interconnectivity. And that means that there isn't autonomy on the part of the individual. There's some autonomy, yes, but the autonomy is deeply shaped and affected by the surrounding of other forces, beings, ideas. So we're in this web, or this ocean of interacting parts and ideas and feelings. So we have to find a way that we get over it's me against them. It's us within the natural order of things. And right now, we're fighting nature. We're attempting to dominate it, and we're learning that we have to get on the side of nature instead of trying to conquer it. That's a deeply mistaken belief. Well, just like we can't conquer nature, we have to work with it. We have to work with other human beings, and that those other human beings are acting like us out of a fear. And we have to find some way, which I guess to date, throughout all human history, we haven't found. But we've never had before the capacity to extinguish not only human civilization, but a good part of the rest of the species. So we are at a what do you call it, an inflection point, or a time in our history when the power that has created all this modernity, all the wonderful things that allow us to even be on the Zoom call, it also, as a corollary or as an entailment, has this dark power of destruction. So power is neither good nor bad. It can be used for good or bad. And that can be in the context of Russia and America and China seeing the commonality or not. And I would say the virus is a very bad indicator. We should have united to deal with the virus, because there's going to be another virus and another one. Except all of a sudden it's a big race. Who's going to get the patent? Who's going to make the big bucks? And who are we going to blame? The China for the virus? The Russians are cheating on their vaccine, whatever the hell it is. It's not going to work. And I think we need to use and understand through the virus, through climate change, which affects everyone on the planet, all the other species, and the threat of nuclear weaponry, that there is a new order. It isn't just yesterday, but increasingly in recent decades, in the century at least, we are at a totally new stage. And it's going to be a stage where we either shift to some basic trust based on our understanding of what we have to do, or we're going to make the mistake and we can blow ourselves up, or a good part of us. So that is, it may sound a little bit cataclysmic, but there it is. This is where we are, and we better wake up to it. And I think that's our job as lawyers, as people in public life. Let's see if we can't open our eyes and open the eyes of others to the kind of existence that we have, which is, yes, individualism, but embedded at the very level of our structure in a collective, in a common being, a common web of life. And if we do that, I think we open the door to more intelligent, more wiser use of weaponry, and hopefully its reduction to make the world continue as it has for tens of thousands of years.
That is a visionary note and the proper compass for us. Every other breath is given to us from the phytoplankton. Our very breathing depends on the health of the oceans. And I want to quote you, Governor Brown, in which you said so presciently, "I believe that with humility and grace," maybe that's the key to what we got to get to get the answer. You said it then. "We can discern right from wrong and discover what peace requires." This idea of a sense of humility in the face of the majesty of nature, a sense of humility that we are one human family, a sense of limitation and a sense of grace, that it is graceful to live, that it's not just surviving, but that we can have something a little bit better than simply being consumers, that we can call ourselves to a higher purpose. And
Well, when I ran for president in 1992, I had something called the humility agenda.
oh God,
And
you're
now,
so good.
yes, I had the humility agenda. And now here we are, all these years. I think we're going backwards. I have not perceived humility as being much of an issue among my colleagues. Maybe even myself. I like to get a lot of attention myself. So I haven't even mastered the rudiments of humility. But there is a truth there. And the truth is to get an accurate portrayal, understanding, insight into who we are as individuals, who we are as a nation, who we are as humanity. And I think that humility is closely aligned with truth. And that's what's going to make us free. If we can just pursue the truth, that will lead us to humility. And if we do that, we'll get off the excessive chauvinism that is leading us right over the brink as we talk.
God bless you. Thank you so much, Governor Brown. We're the absolute note to tune the orchestra to. Thank you.
Okay, call upon me anytime. We got a lot of work to do.
Charlie?
Yes, Jonathan, go ahead with your panel. That was absolutely wonderful.
It was
Very
very
inspiring.
it was really more than wonderful. It was absolutely visionary and outstanding. Well, we're going to shift gears and get into the tools that are needed to get us to a safer and saner world. And this next panel addresses the tools that lawyers use in bringing nations together. And this session will be on the international treaty regimes. And we have three extraordinary panelists to address this issue. The first, and I'll just give a little introduction to them now. Are we on? I'm looking at the page.
They're all online.
Do we have everybody? Is Ambassador Ford here, and Ambassador Graham, and Ms. Duffy?
Yep.
Oh, great. Okay. So the first, I'll introduce them so we can just go with the flow. And I want to apologize in advance. Gloria Duffy is going to have to leave us at 2 minutes to 2 on the dot. So, but I want to go first with Dr. Chris Ford, who's the Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation. He was the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. He served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Weapons of Mass Destruction and Counterproliferation at the National Security Council. He is actually, I think, the ranking person, serious thought leader in our government presently on this issue. And it's my honor to give the floor to Ambassador Ford for the next 15 minutes, and then we'll have Ms. Duffy, and then Ambassador Graham, and then some Q&A. Ambassador Ford, please.
Thanks, Jonathan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Great. I'm grateful for the chance to be part of this. Thanks for the invitation, and also for your flexibility in letting me participate from my family holiday here in the mountains. So this is not, for the record, what the State Department looks like on the inside. So many of you listening may not know this or expect it, but actually Jonathan and I are old friends. And I think of him as being always willing to listen, to take ideas seriously, and to engage open-mindedly with them, even when, and perhaps especially when they are ideas that sort of challenge one's preconceptions or preferences. And so, since that is something that is extremely rare in modern political discourse, it's a delight to be able to be part of this. And in that spirit, I hope you all will forgive me for choosing as my focus today a bit of a look if you might call it a sort of a friendly moral and legal critique of some aspects of current disarmament discourse with the aim of trying to get us all to a place where we can in fact more constructively address these challenges together. So what I'd like to do is offer a few thoughts first on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, or the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty, as it's sometimes called. And then on following up on that, on international humanitarian law from the perspective of nuclear weapons from the perspective of international humanitarian law. So starting on the ban, just for the record, although I've said these points many times before, I'll just say them very quickly. For those countries the many countries that rely directly or indirectly on nuclear weapons for their security, the ban treaty is a fairly straightforward issue. We're not going to join it. We already consider it to be a failed treaty, and upon its entry into force, it won't bind us. All these many states who rely in one way or the other upon nuclear weapons for security have also made very clear their rejection of a potential ban at this time, and the rejection of the idea that there is any hint of what lawyers will recognize as opinio juris in the non-use of such weapons since World War II. And these messages should make, I think, pretty clear to all concerned that there is not even a scintilla of a customary international legal norm against nuclear weapons emerging. But these are not new points from a US government official, so I won't dwell on them here. But what I'd like to do a little bit is, talking about the ban, is to stress a couple of points. And one is to point out what I think are the moral implications of the likely selectivity of the treaty's impact. And secondly, to talk a little bit about some of the, or at least to point out, what I think may be the crisis instability problems that could be engendered in a world without nuclear weapons, and perhaps nuclear use incentives that could be created thereby, which may seem paradoxical, but I think it's actually a concern that we need to take very seriously. But on the first point, the selectivity, the ban is the result of a campaign of civil society activism and grassroots pressures that are directed, of course, at legislators and elected representatives, pushing them towards treaty accession or ratification. And of course, civil society activism is a well-established way to seek social change, and an entirely legitimate one. The problem, however, I think in this context on the global stage should also be pretty obvious. And that is that nuclear weapons possessors that lack a free press and that use draconian tools of political oppression to suppress disfavored opinion and political activism in their civil societies, to the degree that they even have them at all, such regimes are highly resistant and perhaps even immune to the kind of civil society pressures that the ban has been driven by. So to the degree that it actually succeeds in influencing the legislators and politicians that it targets, the ban treaty approach has the potential to bring about nuclear disarmament really only for those free democratic societies that actually listen to their citizenry and their citizens' concerns. But I have to think that it can't precisely be a moral imperative to bring about a world in which only dictators such as Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un are the sole possessors of nuclear weapons. So that's a concern that I think people in the ban movement spend far too little time addressing. But I think it may even get worse than that, in the sense that for the sake of argument, let's assume that the ban were actually, in fact, to persuade all possessors to get rid of their weapons, and for that to occur. It's not obvious to me that the world that would thereby create is necessarily a world more desirable even than today's world. A world in which nuclear weapons have been dismantled, but in which countries still know how to build them and still face all of the many conflicts and rivalries and challenges of a very problematic security environment. That world may in fact be a world, could be certainly a world that is more unstable and more likely to see nuclear weapons used than today's world. I've talked about this in other fora in more detail, but just to make the point briefly here, in that kind of a world, every technology holder would have not merely an incentive to engage in, I guess, what you might call a reconstitution race to build nuclear weapons anew, anytime they're in a major military crisis with another technology holder. Yes, they would have that incentive to race, to reconstitute, but they would also have an incentive to use such nuclear weapons first if they happen to win the race. In other words, if they happen to reconstitute their arsenal before their adversary, who is furiously trying to reconstitute his arsenal, also got there. So you almost create more incentives to use nuclear weapons preemptively in such a world and to turn every single crisis, as Thomas Schelling has observed, into a nuclear crisis than is the case today. And that is without even factoring in what I think may also be a very dramatic problem of the fact that by dismantling the architecture of nuclear deterrence, you may in fact give great powers more incentives to engage in conflicts with each other in the first place, thus teeing up the likely dynamics of such reconstitution, perhaps with even more frequency than they have been in the last many decades of great power peace under the nuclear umbrella. So I say this not to say that I know for sure what such a disarmed world would look like, but to make the point that these are enormously more complex issues and questions than one normally hears from disarmament advocates, particularly in the ban movement. And so if the objective is to achieve, well, in fact, to strengthen international peace and security and to prevent human suffering as effectively as possible, and not simply to say that you have achieved disarmament at really any cost whatsoever, if that is in fact the objective, we have a lot more hard staring at these challenges, I think, than one usually hears in disarmament community debates. So let me put the ban aside and talk quickly about international humanitarian law here too, because I think this is also an area that rewards detail and in which we need to be, I think we have an obligation to get beyond mere assertions and superficial certainties here to look at the real complexity of the challenge, because I think it really does matter. If we can put aside some of our blinkered certainties, I think it would be really valuable. And we might be able to make some, in fact, concrete progress in facts on the ground in making the world somewhat safer. If we were, for example, to put aside simple assertions about the fact that there is absolutely, well, to put aside the categorical statements about the per se impossibility of ever having or using nuclear weapons in a way consistent with international law, and looked more at the details of how it is that countries actually approach these questions. Because not all postures and doctrines, I fear, are created equal. And if we can make some distinctions amongst them and identify particular points of friction or challenge in ways that actually address themselves to concrete policy proposals, as opposed to waving one's hands and saying the whole thing is just a misbegotten mess from the outset and should go away, that's really, I think, where there is more prospect for real change, frankly, in the world. From a US perspective, I think our approach to these things, holds up pretty well. I fully grant that if your starting assumption is that there is absolutely no legal or moral case for nuclear weapons possession in the first place, that there's no reconciling that position with our doctrine. Fair enough. But I don't think it's that simple. And I do think it is really important to remember how various doctrines and postures and approaches are in fact structured, because it may matter between them. From a US perspective, I think we are a model of transparency and openness and accountability in this. We are practically an open book with regard to doctrines and postures and plans and numbers and systems and all of the things that you might want to know about how someone approaches nuclear weapons. Even if you don't like what you see, at least we give ground and opportunity and traction and material for real serious engaged debate on this sort of thing. And I think we're a model of that. I wish others, some in particular, were enormously better like that. But when it comes to issues of international humanitarian law, we should remember the 1996 ICJ case, of course, on nuclear weapons use, which referred to was not willing to rule out the possibility of nuclear weapons use in what it described as an extreme circumstance of self-defense, in which the very survival of the state would be at stake. And in light of that very particular phrasing, it's worth noting, and I think it is probably no coincidence, that US nuclear doctrine has long stressed that the use of nuclear weapons would indeed make sense only in extreme circumstances. Our declaratory policy is rooted in collective defense, exclusively against the most dire of threats, and in connection with protecting the vital interests, not just of the United States, to be sure, but also of our many allies and partners. That is to say, the countries, the numerous democracies of North America and the Pacific Rim that rely upon our extended deterrence for their own safety, and perhaps even for their continued existence as independent sovereign states. So that context is important. And I'd also point out the degree to which we are very explicit in recognizing the applicability of international humanitarian law to any potential use of nuclear weapons. US doctrine and weapons policy guidance have made this clear for a very long time. We have a routinized involvement at a very deep operational level of military and DoD civilian lawyers in nuclear planning and operational matters. This is a commonplace in our system, at least. And such lawyers are an official part of formal and informal planning targeting and operational processes of all sorts, policy reviews, weapons evaluations, and so forth, precisely in order to ensure consistency with the law of war and relevant implementing guidance. All members of the U.S. Armed Forces, of course, are also subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which obliges them under criminal penalty to refuse to follow unlawful orders, such as those that direct them to violate the laws of war. So there are some formidable doctrinal and procedural safeguards built into how we think about these things, including review and advice by lawyers. And this is true across our entire military spectrum, not simply with respect to nuclear weapons, but certainly nuclear weapons is an area that is not an exception to this. And so in the context, the broader context of the fundamental purpose of our deterrent force in deterring aggression, I think we stand in the US in a pretty strong position, particularly vis-a-vis some other nuclear powers, with regard to our approaches. And if you're looking for points of departure on where to push for real concrete change in ways that could help make doctrines and policies more consistent with international humanitarian law, you might look to some of those partners for focus of attention. For example, I think there are some real reasons to be concerned about Russian doctrine and policy. Now, it's true, of course, that they say that their doctrine conforms with international law, that Russia has nuclear weapons only for defense and deterrence, and these would only be used in extremis. I hope that's the case. But there are some interestingly worrying signs. The Russians have, for example, suggested that they might respond with the all-out use of nuclear weapons if they see even a single incoming ballistic missile, apparently irrespective of whether or not that missile is likely to be armed with a conventional or a nuclear warhead, whether its target is a city or an empty stretch of taiga, for example. And especially coming from a country that itself possesses an enormous arsenal of missiles that are capable of carrying nuclear or conventional warheads rather interchangeably. It's not entirely obvious to me how such a threat of nuclear use in response to any missile attack would always be consistent with the law of armed conflict. So these are things on which I think the Russians might perhaps be pressed to answer some questions and to display some real transparency and clarity in how they approach these things. Another point of worry is their development of the so-called Poseidon system, a nuclear-powered underwater drone that the Russians apparently intend to fit with massive multi-megaton nuclear warheads and launch across the sea in wartime in order to inundate US cities with radioactive tsunamis. I'm not making this up. This operational concept raises surely some very serious questions about the extent to which it could possibly be used in compliance with applicable legal rules and principles. And then, of course, there's the rather infamous dead hand or perimeter system, which has been described in media accounts and which the Russian Strategic Rocket Forces commander, I think, seems to have confirmed back in 2011, a system that would automatically launch all Russian nuclear forces in the event that its computer brain, that it detected detonations in Russia and its computer brain lost contact with the general staff. Could Russia really defend such a system as being anything other than some kind of a barbarian's vindictive funhouse mirror of retribution after Russia's already lost a war? I don't know, but goodness, we should be asking them these questions. This ought to be a focus of very considerable concern in the disarmament community. And I also take, Governor Brown made the point in the last panel, Jonathan, about how the rule of law rests upon a consensus of values and principles. And I think that's true, but it's also a little bit worrying in this context because in another area that I've worked on very closely, issues of cyberspace security and how the law of armed conflict applies in cyberspace, Russian officials have in recent months begun to try to walk away from prior affirmations that international humanitarian law applies, where it is difficult to distinguish civilians from military combatants. They've said that very explicitly now in cyberspace, which is deeply disturbing. But if that is a principle that they think as a matter of law, what on earth does that mean about their likely behavior in the event of a nuclear conflict, especially from a country that possesses things like perimeter and Poseidon? So here is where we should be asking the hard questions, not of people who model transparency and engagement on these issues, but people who try to hide what they're up to and suggest when you do press them on these things some very disturbing ideas and capabilities. So that I think is something that I would suggest the disarmament community should be focusing on. And then of course there's China. I don't think you should be sanguine about their policies either, notwithstanding all of their rhetoric about no first use and minimum deterrence. Not least because, I mean, that's only the beginning of which to say that no first use is, of course, one of those things that one rather doubts would hold up if they were really in danger of losing a conventional war. I've always said that no first use policies are most credible and believable and trustworthy where they are least needed, and where they're most consequential and most needed, you simply can't rely upon them. But there's really much more to it than that. It's not just that Beijing has raised questions about its own first use policy, no first use policy. It's that for a country that has a alleged philosophy of minimum deterrence in the first place, China has been consistently building up the size of its arsenal for a generation now, even during a time in which the threats facing it in nuclear terms from the United States and Russia have essentially fallen through the floor. Since China joined the NPT in 1992, the US arsenal that arguably threatens China and the Russian arsenal that arguably threatens China have fallen by a collective total of something like 60,000 weapons. So over the last generation, the nuclear threat facing China has absolutely fallen off of a cliff. And yet China continues to build and build. This, from a country that professes no first use and minimum deterrence as a policy, you would think that would be the obvious reason for them to cap or even reduce their arsenals. So that plus their obvious embrace of counter value targeting, which is to say deliberately targeting cities as opposed to military assets, these are reasons to ask the Chinese some very hard questions too. So I make all these points just to, well, frankly, to problematize the discourse here, because there is a moralistic simplicity in so much of what one hears coming out of disarmament circles. And I would urge that we pay a lot of really close attention to how the details of these things really do work in the world. Because I think the road to resolving these things and to a disarmed future necessarily runs through a really deep engagement with actual concrete real world issues of security challenges and working those through and ameliorating those in ways that the disarmament community has not been traditionally, if I may be so bold, all that good at doing. And I think we've got a lot of work to do also in shoring up institutions such as the NPT and the CWC and the BWC, which are under such enormous threat these days. There's a huge agenda out there, but it's an agenda that involves really embracing the challenges of security and not waving one's hands and trying to wish them away. Sorry to speak so long, but you can tell I feel very strongly about these things, Jonathan. Thanks.
And Ambassador Ford, we'll be returning. You'll have more opportunity to speak before we close out. Miss Gloria Duffy is presently the head of the Commonwealth Club. She's built it to be a formidable institution, but there was a period in which she served in government as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and Special Coordinator for Cooperative Threat Reduction. Well, what that means is that she was responsible for negotiating the dismantlement and destruction of the weapons of mass destruction of Russia, the Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. She completed over 50 agreements with these countries for dismantling and disposal of their weapons of mass destruction. She managed a budget in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and her service in our government was an unequivocal success story. And my only possible debate with this amazing woman is the failure of the government to take victory laps for such successes and let more people know that we technically know how to get to a safer world. Gloria Duffy, please. And I'll apologize on your behalf that you're going to leave us at 2 o'clock sharp. And but we're going to get you back somehow.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Well, again, thanks to Jonathan, Tom Graham, and other friends and colleagues for inviting me to join you today. And I see some friends on the attendee list. Hello to everybody. Obviously, today's session comes at a very pivotal time. What former Secretary of State George Shultz has just called in his new book, A Hinge of History, comparable to what we faced in the immediate aftermath of World War II. The future of nuclear weapons is one of the areas in which we face some clear and divergent choices on which our future depends. We meet at a time when there are a number of concerning developments the removal of the Secretary of Defense, the resignation of the Director of the National Nuclear Security Organization, and a number of other activities. But I'd like to step back, as concerning as those developments are. That's not the topic of my brief presentation. My expectation is that we will have a peaceful transition in our national leadership. And I'd like to describe how the US might better utilize some of the major tools we have available to us to safeguard our security. Some of which Jonathan referred to, we have been successful in using in the past. Obviously, negotiated arms control agreements have been a major tool for the US in safeguarding our security. Unfortunately, in recent years, the US has been withdrawing from our existing arms control treaties at a rapid pace, based on concerns about other parties cheating on those agreements. In the past 3 years, the US has withdrawn from the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Weapons Treaty with Russia, from the 2015 US-Iran Nuclear Weapons Agreement, and most recently from the 1992 Open Skies Treaty. So in this context, I'm going to talk very briefly today about two aspects of arms control. The first of these is arms control treaty compliance. And I'm also going to review with you the approach to arms control that we did practice, that Jonathan described during the Clinton administration, that was used with great success, that doesn't require formal government-to-government arms control treaties in order to accomplish mutual goals with other countries to reduce the threat from nuclear weapons. So first of all, on arms control compliance, as you all know from other aspects of the law, as difficult and prolonged as it often is, the negotiation of agreements is only the first step in their efficacy. Any agreement negotiated must be supported by mechanisms for dispute resolution, and those mechanisms have to be used actively for an agreement to be a living and effective document. Most arms control treaties over the years have been negotiated with compliance and dispute resolution mechanisms built in, ranging from on-site inspection rights to institutions like the Standing Consultative Commission, or the SCC, that was established to support the SALT, or Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties process, by providing a forum to raise and resolve compliance issues. It's inevitable that disputes will arise about the terms of treaties, and in some cases, such as major abrogations of treaty provisions, withdrawal from those treaties is certainly justified. But for some years now, I don't think the dispute resolution provisions of arms control treaties have been effectively utilized. To do so is very hard, ongoing diplomatic work, but it can be done, and it's worked in the past. The past 3 years isn't the first time the US has complained about other countries' non-compliance with arms control agreements, and indeed where we've experienced some difficulties with compliance. It's also not the first time we have not used all of the dispute resolution and compliance mechanisms at our disposal. A similar scenario took place early in the Reagan administration, when the new administration was concerned about Soviet non-compliance with arms control treaties and threatened to pull out of several of them. Together with a group of colleagues based at Stanford in the mid-1980s, we reviewed all the then current disputes about arms control compliance, and in a book titled Compliance and the Future of Arms Control, made some recommendations for better use of the dispute resolution mechanisms that existed to support them. There was a hearing on our report and the compliance issues by the House Foreign Affairs Committee in 1987. We testified about the status of the complaints about non-compliance with existing treaties and the opportunities to resolve the concerns through the existing dispute resolution mechanisms. I also made some recommendations about how to improve the process of resolving arms control disputes. In the end, not only did the Reagan administration work to resolve the existing disputes, but they decided to keep the existing arms control treaties in effect, and they negotiated and completed the INF treaty and began negotiations on a START agreement. Similarly, the process of arms control can continue now with efforts to resolve disputes concerning old treaties and possible negotiation of new arms control treaties supported by dispute resolution mechanisms. The second comment I'd like to make is that formal arms control treaties are not always necessary to solving pressing international security problems, including those involving the nuclear threat. I'd like to take us back to the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. Sam Nunn, former Democratic senator and chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, visited the Soviet Union during the summer of '91. He found Mikhail Gorbachev on house arrest in the Crimea during a coup attempt. He wondered who had the nuclear command authority at that time, with nuclear weapons spread all around the former Soviet Union. He came back and with his Republican colleague, Dick Lugar, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, wrote the Cooperative Threat Reduction Act, which was passed by Congress in record time, bipartisan, and became what was known as the Nunn-Lugar program. I was privileged to work on this at the Defense Department, as Jonathan mentioned. Once this agreement, once the legislation existed and the program was up and running. This legislation gave the US the authority to use our Defense Department funds and other kinds of assistance to reduce the threat to ourselves from weapons of mass destruction in the former Soviet Union by working with the former Soviet countries directly, those that had weapons of mass destruction. In the end, we were able to dismantle thousands of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Russia. Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia became nuclear free. They joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We disposed of other weapons of mass destruction, such as chemical weapons in Russia. We were able to re-employ weapons scientists on civilian projects. We did some things to close down bioweapons capabilities in the former Soviet Union and otherwise reorient defense production capabilities. I'm going to screen share for a second a scorecard that was kept by the late and wonderful Senator Dick Lugar as of, I think, 2013 on some of the accomplishments of this program. And you can see 13,300 nuclear warheads deactivated, 1,473 ICBMs destroyed. These were in the 4 countries that had nuclear weapons in the former Soviet Union. It's sometimes said that a new area of international law was created by the Nunn-Lugar program. There were no major international treaties involved. With each country, we concluded what was called an umbrella agreement that we negotiated with the leadership of the State Department. For each project under the umbrella agreement, there was what was called an implementing agreement. That was negotiated again with the help of the State Department, but the leadership of the Defense Department, and I was the person who signed those agreements on behalf of the Secretary of Defense. We had individual implementing agreements on each task involved in the Nunn-Lugar program, removing warheads from Ukraine, cutting up long-range bombers in Russia, removing weapons-grade uranium from Kazakhstan, and so forth. I was involved personally in over 50 of these agreements. Each implementing agreement had provisions for what we called audits and inspections. This legal framework was created by our general counsel at the Defense Department, the late Jack McNeil, and by his deputy and my friend, Jack Beard, who now teaches law at the University of Nebraska. Jack Beard and I were joined at the hip, working very closely together, traveling back and forth to the former Soviet countries to negotiate these agreements. There was an intensive process involved in each of the agreements. We had technical teams which met with the analogous teams from the other countries. They had some amazing experiences with transparency. I will just say that some of our team members were astonished by the access they got in the process of creating these agreements and trying to look on the ground at what was necessary for dismantling weapons of mass destruction in the former Soviet countries. So we worked with each country to identify their needs and then signed an agreement with them to implement that. I think this was remarkably successful, I think perhaps in part because all of these many agreements did not go before the Senate for ratification. We had a process where we notified each agreement that we were planning to sign to the US Congress, and we notified where the funds were going to come from at the Defense Department before we signed the agreements. I had some amazing late night calls back to Washington when I was about to sign agreements in Kazakhstan and elsewhere to make sure that we had notified and identified the funds before the pen was put to paper. Congress gave the Defense Department what was called transfer authority, where we could take funds from other programs to fund this effort, and then we got an annual appropriation from Congress. So the whole process for the most part, did not become a political football. The process required intensive, dedicated work by large numbers of people on the US side. Hundreds of people were involved in the teams and the negotiations, and it was a well-supported effort within the US government by all branches of government. This process, I don't think, has been utilized. There are remaining tasks to do in the former Soviet Union and in other countries regarding the dismantlement of nuclear weapons. The process hasn't been utilized effectively for a number of years. Not surprisingly, there was a request for a cut in the funds for the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program in the 2021 budget. There are a number of ideas around about how this program could be applied in other countries besides the former Soviet Union. We need to return to creative thinking on this model. There are, again, other dangers of proliferation that could be addressed if this issue were given priority, concentration, dedication, funding, commitment, skill, and experience. So I hope that soon we are able to focus more on these approaches. And with that, I am afraid I have to leave the matter. I wish I had a chance to discuss with you, but I'm actually hosting a conference for another organization in just a few minutes in LA. So not on arms control. So thank you very much for your attention, Tom, Jonathan, and Mr. Ford. All due respect for all the work that you've done in the past few years.
Gloria, thank you very much. And we'll miss you. And you'll miss Ambassador Graham. And Ambassador Graham is really an exceptional figure of our time, because there's been a web of treaties, relationships between nations that have arguably been essential to our survival. If you look at the counterfactual, if we didn't have these relationships, if we didn't have these treaties, God knows where we would be. So he was in either a principal legal or diplomatic capacity, a principal involved in the SALT Treaty, the START 1 Treaty, the START 2 Treaty, the INF Treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the indefinite extension of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the creation and signing of the United States of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. In order to be in all of these positions, he has been a prolific author, written numerous books. The last one that really has impressed me was his book on advancing and strengthening the nuclear weapons-free zones, of Latin America, Africa, the South Pacific, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. He is a board member of the Global Security Institute, and I don't believe that he sleeps. Ambassador Graham, please. Tom, you're muted. Tom, you're muted.
There we go.
There you go. Good.
All right, I'll start over again. Thank you, Jonathan, for that introduction and all those treaties. And no, I did give up sleeping years ago. I just want to that. Thank you for the New York State Bar Association for the opportunity to come here and talk, or virtually come there and talk, and about these subjects. And it's great to be on the panel with Chris and Gloria. And my subject is the international treaty structure. And so I'm going to speak more generally than specifically for the most part. And I would begin by noting that we've been on this planet for, human beings have been on this planet for about 200,000 years. And in the last 10,000 in the past years ago, after many, many thousands of years, hunter-gatherers began to gather together in villages and towns, and eventually cities, and eventually many cities. And civilization began probably 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. And one thing that was discovered very early was that a system of laws to preserve peace and stability was essential, was the very essence of civilization within cities, and then later on between cities, and eventually between states. Law, there is nothing without the rule of law. It's what permits civilization, and it should always be protected by all those who work in related fields. And then in the course of the evolution of the international legal system, it became desirable to limit weapons. And one of the early attempts was in the Middle Ages, when the Pope outlawed the crossbow and the longbow. He said they were hateful to God. And I don't think the ban lasted too long, but it was effective for a short time. And then later, much later, the Hague Conventions in 1899 and 1907, I believe, took the first steps in controlling chemical and biological weapons, among other things. Some years after that, the nuclear age arrived, and humanity had developed a weapon that had the capability of destroying the world, but also had the capability of saving the world, fueling the world, and empowering the world, particularly in the time of climate change. So it was important not only to limit the weapons as much as possible, but also to have a hard line between the weapons side of things and peaceful uses side of things. In 1961, President Kennedy gave a press conference in 1963, sorry, it was. And well, no, let me see. I guess it was 1963. Anyway, it had to do with the progress of nuclear disarmament in Geneva. And he said, well, what keeps me up at night and what I worry about most is that by 1970, there'll be 10 nuclear weapon states in the world with weapons fully integrated into their arsenals. And by 1975, 15 or 20 such states. And this is an exact quote. I would regard that as the greatest possible danger and hazard. And not long after that, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, not directly because of that, but because many other people around the world shared that view, the Non-Proliferation Treaty began to be negotiated in Geneva, and in the late 60s was signed in 1968, and it entered into force in 1970. The structure of the treaty is to permit 5 states that had weapons before 1967 to retain those weapons, and the rest of the world that signed up to this treaty, eventually over 190 countries, would agree that they would never have such weapons. And however, and this treaty has been very, very successful. Only I think four countries Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea have developed weapons outside of the treaty. The rest of the world has been nuclear weapon free since they one by one joined the treaty. However, it shouldn't be thought of as a gift from the most of the world to those wonderful nuclear weapon states and all of their good things that they do. It was a strategic bargain. And in exchange for giving up the most destructive weapon ever created, the nuclear weapon states agreed in principle to end the arms race, to ultimately eliminate their arsenals, and to pursue interim steps, as well as create a separate arrangement for the use of peaceful power. The interim steps included a number of things that people are familiar with, but the most important element, the most important piece of that was the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. The thinking was at the time that eliminating the nuclear weapons down to a reason, down to some kind of level where they no longer threatened humanity in the depth of the Cold War would be very difficult. But at least the nuclear weapon states could stop testing the weapons. And that was the bargain. That was the underlying bargain that established the legal regime that I would submit is the centerpiece of international security in the past, in the present, and hopefully in the future. The treaty also was given a 25-year life at which and then there would be a conference with a one-time opportunity to extend that treaty for whatever period or permanently. The review conferences that took place every 5 years, 4 of them, before the review conference, all more or less ended in failure because of the inability of the nuclear weapon states to commit to a comprehensive test ban treaty. And then we got to 1995, and it was agreed that the treaty would be extended permanently, giving us the security of the NPT forever, hopefully, and as long as it lasts, as long as civilization permits it. And the principal price for that was the commitment to a comprehensive test ban treaty or within 1 year. This was achieved in Geneva. The treaty was negotiated in 1 year, and several months later, it was signed actually about 2 months later, it was signed at the United Nations by a number of countries, the United States being the first to sign, Bill Clinton doing the signing. However, because of opposition in the Senate in 1999, the United States has never ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And even though some 170 other countries, including France, Great Britain, Russia, Japan, and a number of others, have ratified it. And so it sits there unratified, not in force. One of the major commitments of the treaty and its extension, and there's no prospect in the near future that one can perceive of ratification taking place. But the parties did, the nuclear weapon states parties did try to, they made an effort to live up to their disarmament obligations under the NPT. I just described the the effort with nuclear weapon testing. But I should also add that in 1993, the United States adopted a moratorium on nuclear weapon tests. That is an informal policy that there would be no more tests. And gradually that spread all over the world. And the tests by India and Pakistan in 1998 were the last anywhere except for North Korea, and regarded as somewhat of an outlier. But in 2019, that country announced that it would do no more tests. How long they stick to that, one can't be sure. Hopefully they're committed to it, but time will tell. But as of right now, no nuclear weapon tests are being performed anywhere. So that's somewhat of a success. The strategic arms limitation process, SALT, START, those treaties, and ending up with the New START treaty did end the arms race. And it caused the reduction of a huge reduction in the number of nuclear weapons that existed in the world. There were the United States at the beginning of the Cold War was producing nuclear weapons at what the French called an industrial rhythm. And we built 72,000 over time, and the Soviets built 55,000. We had 32,500 in our arsenal at the peak moment, and the Soviets had 45,000 in their arsenal for some years. Now there's only 13,000 nuclear weapons in the world, to a large degree because of this series of treaties that were agreed to, which reduced the arsenals. The INF treaty was also agreed to, which alleviated the threat of medium-range ballistic missiles that were also mobile missiles, the SS-20, which surrounded Eastern Europe and also threatened Japan. 1,200 at the peak, and under the INF treaty, they were all eliminated, and we backed away from our much smaller counter deployment. Regretfully, the US recently withdrew from that treaty. I thought it was a mistake because the principal benefits we were getting, that is no SS-20s on Europe's border, and we weren't really doing anything. But in any case, that happened. And there's been an issue with nuclear weapon free zones. The Israeli nuclear arsenal has led the Arabs to insist on a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, and the NPT community thus far has been unable to effectively deal with that. Undoubtedly, it caused the last review conference to fail, and it undoubtedly will come up again. So I guess I'm nearing the end of my time now. So I would ask the question, can the NPT survive? Does it have a medium to long range future? And without it, you can forget any further nuclear weapon disarmament if we ever were to lose the NPT. You can permanently forget it. And I think it's very much in doubt because the world community has not done what it should do with respect to climate change, and its damage is increasing, and it as it advances, many countries are going to lose much of their arable land. It'll become desert, and they'll lose water sources, freshwater sources. And these two things human beings have been fighting about for 3,000 years. And small states that have some arable land or some freshwater sources left, that aren't too far away from large states with big armies that are losing theirs are going quite possibly to look to nuclear weapons to protect them. So I think it will be unless climate change is effectively addressed, I think it's going to be very difficult to hold the treaty together long term. Shorter term, we should do all that we can to strengthen that treaty as much as possible to be able to resist the climate change pressures. And that means ratifying the CTBT and bringing it into force and solving the Middle East nuclear weapon free zone issue. Thank you.
Well, Ambassador Graham, thank you for the hard work you did in both the extension of the NPT and leading the delegation and in the work to getting the test ban treaty. I want to just I think that the NPT is the third most important legal instrument of the 20th century. The first being the UN Charter, the second being the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and of course this treaty that stopped the massive proliferation that both the KGB and the CIA predicted. One of the things I wanted to just segue into this and bring Ambassador Ford in is that the treaty, as you know, as I hope most of the audience knows, and I'll just remind you, had within it a provision that after 25 years, that it would be reviewed to be determined whether it would be extended indefinitely, terminated, or extended for a period of time. The treaty entered into force during the administration of Richard Nixon. And the reason it had that provision is that a lot of countries didn't trust the nuclear weapon states, the P5, China, France, UK, US, and Russia, then the Soviet Union, to fulfill their disarmament obligations. And obviously, during the Cold War, that wasn't being done. And it only changed when, in Geneva of 1985, Gorbachev and President Reagan said a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. And in that commitment, the Geneva statement, they said neither party would seek military advantage over the other. They were opening the door to a different framework, and that change was based on the human element of trust and verification. Trust and verification. And there's a movie that's linked in the program called The Bomb, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, in which there's a big section of a dialogue between George Shultz, who was totally instrumental in that change, and President Gorbachev that I commend to everyone's attention. So in 1995, the states parties come together and agree to indefinitely extend the treaty, but on the condition, 1, progress on the Middle East nuclear weapons free zone, 2, progress on a test ban treaty, and 3, every 5 years, the treaty would be reviewed to determine the progress on disarmament and nonproliferation. So in 2000, a set of commitments, all of them strengthening international law, diminishing no country's stability, and moving toward the framework to obtain a nuclear weapons free world. And most importantly, the explicit commitment to obtain a world free of nuclear weapons was made. And in 2010 at the review conference, even further commitments were made. Now these commitments what are the kinds of commitments? Negotiating a fissile material cutoff treaty, stopping the production of any more nuclear capable materials, strengthening the International Atomic Energy Agency's capacity. And these steps were political commitments. They're not hard law in the way the NPT is, but they are the evidence of the good faith compliance with the disarmament commitment under the treaty. So they have not been fulfilled. The nuclear weapon states are all remiss in actually fulfilling them. And that's, they can argue, and I think that we'll probably hear from Ambassador Ford, that the circumstances have not allowed the fulfillment of these or other reasonable steps that civil society has put forward, and nations are demanding negative security assurance to the countries in nuclear weapons free zones, de-alerting the weapons, and really commencing bona fide negotiations amongst the states with nuclear weapons. But the problem that I have, and then I'm going to hand this over to Ambassador Ford, because I do see the NPT at risk, is that failure to live up to the commitments that we've made in and of itself is not an indication of a lack of good faith. Failure to propose another route, another legal route, another way of advancing toward disarmament in the shadow of failing to live up to the promises, that puts at risk the very foundation of the treaty. Failure to find another route to advance nuclear disarmament. And the modernization program and the rhetoric that we've heard in the last few years from the president has not indicated any serious commitment to fulfilling that legal obligation. And so I hand it over to you, Chris, to say, how are we going to strengthen the NPT and vivify the disarmament commitment in the eyes of the rest of the world?
Oh, thanks, Jonathan. Hopefully you can still hear me. I was fiddling around with my mute button. Hopefully it's not off. Is that good?
Yeah.
Just a couple of things. First of all, just a couple of points of clarification in light of Gloria's remarks. Just to point out that we actually did extensively use the compliance, adjudication, contestation, resolution mechanisms of the treaties in question. Certainly the SVC and the INF treaty was one in which we very clearly engaged the Russians, in addition to literally dozens and dozens of bilateral engagements and multilateral engagements with NATO partners to try to bring Russia's violation of that treaty under control. They refused to do that, of course, but to let the record be clear that we spent an enormous amount of time under two different U.S. administrations using those very same mechanisms that she was describing. The problem wasn't that we tried to use them. The problem was that when we did repeatedly, the Russians were not interested. And to Tom's point about getting the principal benefit of the INF treaty, that being no SS-20s in Eastern Europe, well, that's certainly true. But we got SSC-8s, battalion by battalion, being produced and deployed in Russia in violation of the treaty. So, clearly the substantive benefit that we once got out of the treaty eroded, and Russia expected us to be in the position of refraining from doing things that it felt free to entirely comfortably do itself in violation of its legal obligations. So just for the record there, we also used the compliance mechanisms within the Open Skies Treaty. There was quite a bit of meeting over this last summer, in fact, to try to resolve Russia's compliance problems with the Open Skies Treaty between us and and many of our NATO and other Open Skies partners. The Russians similarly were not interested in that. CTR, she's quite right about the amazing things that CTR accomplished back in the day. And indeed, we still do a fair amount of CTR programming in other areas of the world. I've got an entire office in my bureau, for example.
CTR, Cooperative Threat Reduction.
Correct, yes. Otherwise known as UNLUGR, quite correct. So she's quite correct to point out the really good work that has been done in that area. And indeed, we certainly hope to do more of that. I've got an entire contingency fund standing ready to provide the seed money and the technical expertise for verifying and implementing denuclearization in North Korea, should the North Koreans ever agree to such a thing. Those mechanisms are great mechanisms, but I guess the point that I really want to make is about the broader context. And as much as I enjoy hearing stories of all of the amazing progress that was done in treaty building that Tom has told us about, in dismantling threat systems that Gloria has told us about in the early post-Cold War period, I would urge everyone to remember that context. And in light of what you were saying a moment ago, Jonathan, about the Reagan-Gorbachev statement, we didn't have the end of the Cold War and the reduction of all of those threats and all the possibilities of those treaties because Reagan and Gorbachev said their statement. The Cold War didn't wane because of their statement. The statement came because the Cold War was waning. And you got to keep the cart in front of the horse, not keep the cart in front of the horse here, because the key thing here is that the strategic context of geopolitical rivalry was ameliorated in ways that made possible enormous, wonderful, world historically important things. But just to say that we did these in the 1990s and therefore we are remiss for not doing all those same things and more of them now, entirely misses the geostrategic point, and that is the world that we're in now is a very different one, unfortunately. I wish it were otherwise, but to point to post-Cold War circumstances and say that that we need to do exactly that tomorrow in today's world is just insane. This is not a world that makes that possible. And if there is a route to resolving these problems and moving towards the world of disarmament that we all very much want, that route has to go through engaging with the real world security challenges that this world faces, not simply reminiscing about how, gosh, it would be so great if we were back in 1994. We aren't. And getting us to a place that is analogous to that, where we can make forward progress once again, that's the real agenda for the international security community. And just the fact that things happened before and were great then doesn't actually help us with the dilemmas we face today. And so offering an alternative route, as you suggest, I think has to involve the disarmament community, as I like to say, learning to speak disarmament in the language of security. This isn't just a question of our moral commitment to moving forward. We all have that. The problem here is we are in a world in which major players, and China and Russia most particularly, are not in the place that we imagined them to be, and that we trusted that they would remain when we were making all of those treaties in the 1990s and reducing all of those systems. There was a brief period when we thought that the world was going to be an enduringly benign place, and that Russia and China would become, as the phrase went, responsible stakeholders. They were even, I think, hubristic, but earnestly felt expectations that both of those governments would continue to democratize and grow prosperous middle classes and ultimately become just like us, and we will live together in peace and harmony. The problem is the ensuing years have shown us a China and a Russia that turn out to have had a different agenda. And what they have been busily doing is creating a new security environment of ruthless competitiveness and challenge that makes the recreation of that sort of mid-1990s disarmament zeitgeist impossible without a lot of work on underlying security issues that I see very few people in the disarmament community willing to engage on. And so I think that's really the crux of our problem here. And if there's a way through this, what we have been trying to encourage through something called the Creating an Environment for Nuclear Disarmament Initiative is an engagement on precisely those underlying issues. This is not it's not a negotiating forum in the technical sense, because it's not even clear precisely what the problems that we have to overcome are. What we have been trying to do in this initiative is bring countries together from all around the world and all sorts of different perspectives on nuclear weaponry to think through what the most important challenges are that need to be addressed, and to start to try to apply creative thinking to those challenges. That's something that hasn't really been done. We have been stuck in this conceptual go-to loop in the disarmament discourse for many, many years, in which we look back at, say, Decision 2 from the NPT Review Conference and Extension Conference in 1995, or the 2000 final document or something, and we fixate upon what was said then in that context, and imagine that by doubling down on asking for that, we're going to solve today's problems, and that just isn't the case. I mean, the 2000 final document calls for negotiating START 3, implementing START 2, and fulfilling START. It calls for the ABM treaty. It calls for the trilateral initiative. These are not instruments that even exist in the modern world, and yet to fetishistically call for a focus upon fulfilling all those commitments from 2000 is a fantasy world. It deliberately neglects trying to address the security challenges that we face today. So what we think should happen is countries should come together in things like the CEND initiative to in fact struggle with today's challenges and try to find creative ways to overcome those. The NPT preamble itself talks about the importance of easing tension and strengthening trust between states in order to facilitate disarmament. That phrasing is not an accident. You need to ease tension and strengthen trust in order to make disarmament possible. And unless you're setting about trying to do that and struggling with the real life security challenges that decision makers face in the world, and not just pulling out dust-covered copies of things that we agreed to 35 years ago, you're not going to address today's problems. And so we urgently think it's important for folks to come together and really try to struggle with these problems and getting the world to a place where it becomes a real world feasible choice for countries to, and a sustainable one, to eliminate nuclear weapons and to have security relationships be ones in which you don't then engender reconstitution races between technology possessors, each in a crisis racing to build bombs again before their neighbor gets them, right? And we have a world security structure to create that actually makes that possible. And we can't just pretend that because the Cold War went away in 1991, that therefore in 2021, we will be able to recreate that kind of a magic just because it felt good then. We've got to do a lot better than that. It's going to be a lot harder than that. and buckling down and putting our conceptual energy into finding those kind of answers really is where the answer is going to have to come, if it's going to come at all. And just picking up yesterday's documents and saying that they provide tomorrow's answers just isn't going to do it. I'm sorry.
It is clear that part of those commitments need to be reevaluated because there are changed circumstances. What we've learned about the climate since then compels a new level of cooperation. What the pandemic is showing us is a need, because as far as I can see, the pandemic doesn't carry passports and doesn't care about nations. And I don't want to live in a vaccine apartheid world with walled nation and walled communities and walled people. The fact of the matter is that when the United States makes commitments, we have to show a good faith attempt to live up to them. And they're not dusty covered commitments. The FMC, a Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, is hardly would diminish U.S. security if we entered into that and stopped making, pits. The point is,
Jonathan, we have worked very hard for quite a few years across 3 administrations or 4 administrations now to bring an FNCT into existence. The problem is Pakistan and China blocking it. Why don't you talk to them? We are trying to do our bit.
Oh, the conference, this is sort of arcane to most of the audience.
Sorry.
We've been trying to negotiate it in a particular forum that operates by consensus, and India and Pakistan parties outside of the NPT and outside of that commitment have been blocking that consensus. My overall issue is, absent putting forward more timely framework issues that deal with the actual knowledge we have now, the increased knowledge of the consequences of a small number of nuclear weapons, as well as the global threats that we now face. That is the problem that I'm squarely addressing to the administration, that we are neglecting to live up to the promises we've made. And by the way, it's not just this administration. The Obama administration did not move fast enough and fulfill the vision from Prague that the president put forward. And I do think that this initiative you have in creating the environment has to be an ongoing evaluation of how do we create the holistic environment, not just isolating it in terms of the treaty, but the relationships between states. How do we define security? What are our core security interests? But that endeavor has to include civil society organizations as well, Ambassador. It's been mainly diplomats only, not bringing in a holistic approach. That environment would include addressing climate, addressing public health, addressing eliminate the sustainable development goals, all of the collective issues that would create a different set of relationships amongst nations. It's odd that the business community has done so much to create a more integrated world. And I see Charlie Moxley jumping in here because the gift of time is not ours. And Charlie, can we let Ambassador Graham have a final word before we hear from the president of the ABA?
Yes, of course. That would be
And
great.
Chris, I apologize that you can't have a sir rebuttal. And last but not least, the World Court did say that they couldn't determine that in all instances international humanitarian law would not be violated by the use, but they did say that in any instances, even in state and exigent circumstances, international humanitarian law and its constraints would apply. And God knows we need to have a real robust discussion of how nuclear weapons and IHL, maybe we have to choose the law of power or the power of law. I apologize at a time. I really do. Let's do this again. Let's do some more.
Am I supposed to talk?
We have the
now?
president of the American Bar. Yes,
Okay.
Please do, Tom.
Oh, all right. Well, my objective is to make the world as safe as possible, and arguing over past commitments, what they may or may not be, is not as much interest to me. I want to make the NPT as strong as possible. We have 2 existentialist threats facing us: climate change and nuclear weapons. To protect civilization from climate change is going to require cooperation among states at a level we've never known. If we can do that, we can eliminate nuclear weapons as well. But I want to keep the door open for nuclear weapon elimination by protecting the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And unless we deliver on the 2 points that I mentioned, and probably some other related things, it won't be strong enough to last through the first wave of climate change. So I think test ban is something would be relatively easy to accomplish. The Middle East will be very difficult to solve, but we should focus on those issues and see what can be done to preserve the NPT to the era when maximum cooperation against climate change, if it comes, will exist. And then that atmosphere, maybe we can go all the way to elimination. And that atmosphere has to come if civilization is to be saved from climate change ultimately.
Thank you. We now have the privilege of hearing a pre-recorded from the president of the American Bar Association.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Let me introduce the president of the ABA. But let me first say that it's very hard to move beyond this past panel, a wonderful discussion and very thought-provoking. And we'll carry it through the day and carry it into hopefully a follow-up program where we can take the dialogue to the next level. I think we can have no better sequel to this panel than to say that the ABA is the largest voluntary association of attorneys and legal professionals in the world. And its international section is very active in the area of national security, including disarmament and addressing limits on nuclear weapons.